Hi, I'm Starlet Massey with Massey Law Group. My colleague Nikki Barker and I had the opportunity to meet with AI ethicist Masheika Allgood in early 2020 to discuss artificial intelligence in the law. Despite the passage of nearly 2 years, we believe that this is still an important conversation for lawyers. We encourage attorneys to become better educated on the impact of AI on the legal system. I would like to thank Masheika for taking the time to make this information more accessible to us. And thank you for listening.
Thanks for inviting me. This should be fun.
Good. Well, we wanted to talk about artificial intelligence. So let's start with the basics. What is AI?
Good question. So artificial intelligence, for the most part, is a branch of machine learning. So it's we create these systems that are statistically based. And what they really do is identify patterns in large amounts of information. So what we call artificial intelligence right now is a form of modeling, which is called deep learning. So we pour a whole lot of data into a model, and based on the patterns it finds, it determines, should something be classified a certain way? What can I glean from this information? So it's really just a pattern matcher with statistical underpinning. That's the foundation of AI.
If AI is good at recognizing patterns, what is AI not so skilled at? And how is that misaligned with the average understanding of what AI is?
AI is not good at intelligence. It doesn't actually think. It can't make decisions in a recognizable real way. So, for example, we talk about predictive AI, right? And it's AI that's supposed to be able to predict what will happen in the future. Really, what we've done is pour a lot of information into this model, and based on the information, the model says, okay, this is what you've done in your past, so I'm assuming this will happen in the future. So I like to, I had friends back in the day who worked in the service industry, and so we used to go out a lot. The bar tabs were ridiculous. I wasn't working at the time, and so I had to be, shall we say, strategic about which bar tabs I picked up. So I would, wait until there was one that was reasonable. And I recall one day, one of my friends, I found a tab. It was like $80. I was like, yes, I jumped on it. And then 5 minutes later, a friend walks up and she's like, I'm not paying another tab until Sheikah pays a tab. And everyone turned around, I was like, she just paid, right? But based on my previous pattern, she was correct, right? If she were AI, the information suggested that I hadn't paid a tab, so I won't pay a tab, right? Because that's what it knew. But I had other reasons. I had other purposes. I wasn't just not paying. And when something changed for me, then I made a different decision. So the difficulty with AI is it doesn't necessarily know your motivations. It doesn't know what would change to make you change your behavior. All it can say is based on your previous behavior, this will likely be your future behavior. And we all know that humans are not that binary.
And despite those limitations, AI is currently being used in conjunction with the implementation of justice. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and it's because techies are good at what we do, right? A lot of it is, we say it can do a certain thing, and if it's kind of like going to a mechanic, right? If he tells you that you need a very expensive part, most of us are just going to buy the part. We don't know. And so if I tell you that AI is predictive and it can be fairer than people, then you assume, oh, then it is fairer than people. But if you talked and you interrogated the people who are building the AI, they'll be very clear about, oh no, it's not fairer than us yet. That is the future, that is the hope, that is the goal. But they're not selling it as a future hope goal. They're selling it right now. And we know that it has problems, but the people who we're selling it to and the people who it greatly affects are not in the conversation, and they're not in a position to say no. And so tech has done a really good job marketing AI as something that it isn't right now.
And that's really why we're here today. Can you give some examples that we may not be aware of how AI is being used in conjunction with the law?
AI is, it's ubiquitous in like our entire life, but specifically for the law, they're using it in child welfare decisions. So to decide who should keep their kids and who likely should not keep their kids, who, you should send more people out to and take, concerns more seriously as opposed to people you can let slip through the cracks. It's being used in housing, so lending. So Equifax and Ellie Mae use it kind of to determine, who should get mortgages, market analysis. So like what is the range of values like in your area, property appraisals. It's being used in education to identify at-risk children. Which is a good and a bad thing. So I think it was UT Austin used that to give extra help to freshmen who it said would be at risk. Whereas a different school, Mount St. Mary's, the president basically just threw out all the struggling freshmen because he didn't want the retention rates to be affected. And so once again, it's a tool. People use it for positive and negative. Social services has been using it. It caused a massive problem in Michigan, or is it either Michigan or Illinois, where the AI just couldn't keep up with the demand for coronavirus and just based on its own internal pattern matching, decided that most people were fraudulent. And then their system went down at the same time, so you couldn't even upload the documents to prove that you were who you say you were and you deserve these benefits. We all know it's being used heavily in policing, but it's been used in a variety of ways. So currently DNA searches are being used by the police to do closed cold cases, facial recognition, which is horribly biased, and we all know it, but they're being used to, I think it was in Michigan again, a man got arrested based on faulty facial recognition. And the Detroit police said that the AI is wrong 96% of the time, but they're still using it.
I think that some things are relevant in all of those examples. When you talk about AI selling points and how AIs are evaluated, what does the tech world look at? And what's a fair way to evaluate AI to determine if it's successful?
So that's an argument that's up for a lot of debate, because the thing is AI is built on statistics, and statistics has some pretty hard rules, right? So basically we have what we call true positive, true negative, false positive, false negative, right? So a true positive is I predict that this person should be in this group and this person actually should be in this group, right? A false negative is I predict that this person should not be in this group when they should have been in that group, right? So there are, for 100 cases or all the cases, a certain percent are going to be correct on the positive end, correct on the negative end. A certain percent are going to be wrong on the positive end, wrong on the negative end, right? But if 30% are wrong, right, there's going to be some room in there. How much is it wrong on the positive side? How much is it wrong on the negative side, right? And those numbers will always have to add up. So if I'm dealing with different groups, I can't ensure that it's right in the same way for all groups. So when we're looking at COMPAS in sentencing or corrective decisions, right, it highly overestimated that Black people would recidivate, right? And highly underestimated that white people wouldn't, right? So you're balancing the one off the other. So if I want to make it fair, so okay, I don't want me to overestimate Black people, then you're going to start overestimating white people in a different way. They even each other out, right? They're inversely related. So there's no real way for it to be completely accurate, at the level that we're asking, and then treat the groups the same. So I'm either going to over penalize one group or over penalize another group, because those numbers have to add up over time. Or I can say, well, I want to treat you guys the same. Well, then I'm not going to be as accurate for both groups. I'm going to be way accurate for one group and way inaccurate for another group. So statistics just doesn't allow for us to treat groups the same and be accurate at the same time. So someone always suffers. And right now, that's minorities. That's women, that's children, that's Hispanics and Black people. And Native Americans to a lesser degree, because there's less of them in the system right now.
So let's kind of back up, because I think when you're talking about balancing false positives and false negatives under the statistical theory, if you have, say, 10% inaccuracy on the positive side and 10% inaccuracy on the negative side, you're saying that's considered fair from a
Well, yeah,
statistical analysis.
because it was equally wrong for both groups. So if I over penalize Black people and under penalize white people, well, then it's accurate and it's fair, because it doesn't matter which way I'm going. If I'm 60% wrong both ways, then it's accurate, right? It's treating those groups the same. And that's where we have difficulty, because fairness as attorneys is not to just, well, we were wrong the same amount. It makes a big difference how you're wrong. It makes a fundamental difference how you're wrong. And that is not how these algorithms have been built. And lawyers aren't involved in the conversation. So they're not looking at us. If we're looking at penalizing decisions, any kind of punitive decision, then we want to be wrong on the side of letting people go, as opposed to, over penalizing them. But is that what the regular public wants, right? And so is that really what we end up with? Like, who is at the table making these decisions? Well, currently we aren't. And the techie said it doesn't matter. And it's unbiased because it doesn't look at the different groups, which clearly is foolishness. So we're ending up with a situation where, we're not, the systems that we're using in the law don't actually live up to the values and the definition of fairness that the law requires.
Well, let's talk about the definition of fairness that the law requires, because it, from an attorney's perspective, it doesn't sound anything like the definition of fairness you just gave for a statistical evaluation of the AI itself, how its performance is going.
I fully agree with that. But right now, like, we're having this conversation, but who is setting the ground rules? Like right now, there's nothing in the law that says how things have to be fair when they come into the law. There's nothing in the law that indicates, besides what we know as our standards and our requirements, there's no hardline rule that says that the technology has to follow those same standards. And that's the problem.
So what fairness standards should AI programs be held to?
I don't think they're any different than anything else, right? So in the law, we have a preference for, let 10 people go free, but not let one person, be unjustly prosecuted. That is fundamental to the American legal system and how we see the world. And so that needs to drive how these systems work, right? So I think people are looking at AI as something separate that we need to regulate separately and create different rules for, but I don't think any of that's necessary. The law has been here, and the law has its own rules and regulations. The tools that we use should conform to the norms in our industry, right? So when you're looking at, these systems and they come in, there are things that we as attorneys need, right? Like, we need to be able to interrogate something. Like, if you're making decisions, if a corporation makes a decision about a person, I need to know how you made that decision. I need to know the data it was based on. I need to know who was involved in the decision-making process. What were the factors that were involved? I need to know how it affects people on the back end. Is that what I consider fair? But we haven't required that of the tech. And the conversation usually kind of devolves around, well, they have the right, to their proprietary algorithm, but I don't need your algorithm, right? If you give me the data that you trained on, that lets me interrogate, like, is this the type of person that is, a one-to-one match with the type of people that you're using it to make decisions on, right? If you tell me the factors that are important, then that matters, right? Because then I can interrogate, is this really a factor that means anything? If you tell me how, what the impact is, I can determine, is this disparate impact or not? Like, we have these concepts within the law. We just need to apply them, specifically and explicitly to AI.
And is it fair to say that isn't happening now? Because I know that AI is being used in the criminal justice system, and I'd appreciate, one, if you could tell us a little bit about how that's worked and the history there, and then, has AI been vetted in its use in that system?
AI hasn't been vetted by any legal group. The American Bar Association didn't vet it. The National Bar Association, the APAC Bar Association, none of our professional bar associations have vetted it. None of our state bar associations have vetted it. Basically, AI has worked its way into the law through government procurement. Clerks bought it because they're trying to make their systems more efficient. But, we have to be proactive. I was speaking with a judge the other day, and the conversation was around, people are just moving into tech and it's unpredictable. And I was like, yes, I'm glad you're noticing because back in the day, tech was driven by governments. The government created the internet. The government pushed, it was in national science funding and different Rand Corporation. Like there were ways that the government drove innovation. But we're in the digital age. So the hardware is easy to get, the data is everywhere, the technology is everywhere. And so anybody can jump into the game. And so we as the legal industry need to understand that the game has changed and we can't be reactive, we have to be proactive. So the way Compass came up through Wisconsin is that it was being used and then someone sued. And I just don't think it's fair that the first time a judge who may not even use email, may still have clerks writing email for them, the first time that they get tech on their desk is some complicated AI system that no one is in the legal system is vetted and understands. Like we can't put that pressure.
I'm not really familiar with the Compass litigation that you're talking about. Can you describe that?
It's Wisconsin v. Loomis. It is the lawsuit that allowed for predictive sentencing to be used, or predictive algorithms to be used in sentencing. So someone got a high risk score and couldn't, get a clear understanding why. And so it basically went up to the state courts, went up to the Supreme Court. And if you read through the documents, there's just a lot of fundamental lack of understanding of how the tech works. And part of that is just because we don't deal with it. We don't know it. And then part of it is because we didn't know as much about this tech at the time. Like basically tech has made America its beta testers, right? So we're finding out more every day, every week, every year. And so when the tech came up to the Supreme Court, they were like, well, it's a tool like any other tool. So just slap some warning labels on it. Judges will know what to do with it. That has not borne out. It just hasn't. It's not required. But for some reason, we've taken that to mean, well, it's allowed, so it's required. And so it's been proliferating and no one's been asking the fundamental questions.
Can you talk about the results from Compass's trial run in Broward County in Florida and how those results compare to the real life outcomes?
The outcomes in Florida are very similar to the outcomes everywhere else. It was highly unfair to certain groups, particularly youth and minorities and women, because the data it was trained on, the data is 80% of whether an algorithm will do what it needs to do. Basically, it can only see patterns in what it has seen, right? So if it doesn't have any data about you, then it can't make any kind of accurate prediction. And so it assumes the negative a lot of times, right? And then if it only has skewed data about you, then it can't make accurate predictions. So Compass was looking at, well, how many contacts have you had with the police? Well, Black people obviously have more contacts with the police than white people. It doesn't make them more criminal. It's the nature of bias and policing in this country. But Compass took that to mean, well, you're at higher risk of recidivism because you're spending a lot of time, with the police. But I'm from Florida and I've been pulled over by police in my nice car way more than any of my white friends. But it didn't make me more criminal. It was just the nature of I lived in Florida and I had a really nice car and they didn't think I should be in it, right? But Compass took this as part of, what they're looking at. They're looking at, how much or your level of education. They're looking at where you live, what your family situation is. So all of these things just automatically kind of skew, against minorities, but none of these things are true predictors of criminality. Like there's still arguments about that. So it punished people based on who they are.
We know that because the outcomes that were studied over a period of time were inconsistent in terms of those estimated to be reoffenders.
And there's been more work on that. So, there was a whole big thing around Compass. ProPublica did some articles. They went back and forth with the company that put out Compass for a while. But since then, there have been a couple of different studies where they looked at how Compass worked in different areas. And what they found is it overpenalizes Black people. It heavily overpenalizes youth. The number one predictor of reoffense, according to Compass, is your age. So why we as a society figure, young people, we need to give them an extra chance and we kind of try to lower their penalties, Compass believes that we should hammer them because if they're young and they're offended now, the chances of their reoffending is massive. So you should greatly increase how you penalize young people, right? So when they do the studies, what they found out is first that in most of these jurisdictions, the judges just stopped using it. They just stopped using it because it didn't work with their values. And in the places where the judges continue to use it, you see this disparity in sentencing amongst different groups. So for my purposes, I'm like, well, if the judges aren't going to use it anyway, right? Over time, if over time the judges are losing faith in it, if it's already proven to be difficult and it's expensive as hell, why are we even having this conversation? So an article came out in the Atlantic maybe a week or so ago where the judge they had a couple judges, and judges usually don't speak, but being that we're on this whole considering criminal penalties, they were like, really what we need is a spreadsheet. Like what we're looking for is the ability to determine if our sentences are way out of whack with other sentences in our region. Like that's really what we want. And there's an attorney, Al Barlow, out of Jacksonville, who created basically that, a systematic spreadsheet. It's called ESAS. And it allows you to see, based on all of the sentencing factors, what are the general, sentences, like what's the range? And it lists, it's a spreadsheet. So it lists everybody within a certain period of time who had, the same score sheet. And it'll let you sort by region, by judge, by age, gender, and that's what people are looking for. Is I want to make sure that I'm fair. But that's the difference when you create tech for the industry that had the industry in mind. What we're having right now is we techies are creating stuff and then figuring out where we can sell it. And that's why it doesn't align with our values, because lawyers aren't involved in the conversation at all. By the time a lawyer gets it, it's been sold to us. And we have to be proactive. Like there's no way for us to stay ahead of the game if we're just always reacting to the bad stuff that comes to us.
Right. It's too late. And I mean, I think you've indicated that one of the first places AI was used was actually parole. Is that right?
Well, the compass systems, yes. No, the predictive systems were for parole.
Okay. And should we have realized then that it was not going to do what we intended it to do?
We should have realized it then, but we've actually compounded the problem, because if it's used for parole, then what Compass is looking for is your ability to recidivate, right? Like they're looking at what is the likelihood that you recidivate, right? Which is the number one thing you want to look at, once you're trying to parole out of jail. That makes sense. But when we're getting into actual sentencing for a crime, recidivism isn't the number one thing that we're looking at. We need to know, is this person, do they have remorse? Like, are they doing anything within their communities? Like, are they helping themselves? Like, there are different considerations there. And if we're looking at bail considerations, then we're looking at, well, what is their family structure? Like how likely are they to leave, the community? Like these are completely different decision-making processes, but we're using an AI that's set up for post-jail release, which has a very specific mandate. So AI can only answer the question you ask it. Like it can't just shift. Like you have to retrain it. You have to retrain AI for everything. If it works on chess, it will not work on checkers. Those are fundamentally the same game, but you have to create an entire new model because it doesn't stretch, it doesn't move in that way. But we're taking a system and just moving it around in different parts of the sentencing process and say, well, it's for sentencing. So we've compounded the issue.
How prevalent is this technology in the criminal justice system right now?
I think there are 28 states using some form of sentencing, of predictive sentencing right now, technology. And the difficulty is it's different per group. It's not like necessarily the state has a system that they roll out through every county. Different counties are using it, different counties are not. They're using different types of software, even within the same state. There's just no rules. There's just no rules.
So who is responsible for reviewing the outcomes and the accuracy? I mean, how are we controlling this? How are we monitoring this as a society? Where's that responsibility?
Right now, no one has taken it. Right now, it lies with the person who purchased it, and they may have to file a report with the state, but that's nothing is written in stone. All we've been getting really is legislators mandating that we use the software, but then they don't provide any rules for it. And so it's just coming to lawyers like, well, they said you have to use the software, and lawyers and judges are just kind of making it happen. But there's no system. It's just out there.
What do you
But
recommend?
let's not only get caught up on this, because there are other implementations of AI that we need to discuss, but this is particularly troubling. But there are other really troubling. I don't, we want to make sure we get the range, but yeah. So this is just one area, and criminal lawyers have woken up to this, and they're trying to put in, efforts and rules and processes. And I encourage all of that. Like I encourage just stopping first and asking, do we need AI for this? Especially when you've got like the program that I outlined earlier, the ESAS program, like things that specifically address the problem from the point of view that lawyers want. So I think it starts with a fundamental conversation with state bar associations, professional bar associations, like what is out there that is in production, and do we need it? And what do we do to either stop it, change it, or do something different? So I think that conversation needs to happen.
We're trained to think about fairness when it comes to the criminal law, and I believe that the application does a good job of highlighting the flaws in AI in that sense. Are those same flaws found in the AI that is being used in rental or mortgage applications or in credit decisions?
So I think there was an article that came out a couple of weeks ago about how AI systems are basically entrenching poverty, right? And they're keeping people in this cycle, and it comes in a variety of ways. So, your housing, oftentimes, like you go to rent a place, and they use AI to determine, if you're credit worthy, or you go to get a mortgage, and they use AI to determine, what your rate should be. If I'm looking at mortgage rates, right, and I'm feeding all this data into the AI, mortgage rates have traditionally been massively more expensive for minorities to get. Black people pay more for a mortgage. Spanish people pay more for a mortgage. Like it's entrenched racism in our systems that is just historical. Well, what are we feeding into the AI? We're telling it this is the pattern, that Black people, Hispanic people, unmarried people should pay more. And so that's what it does. All it does is this is the pattern that it has been, and this is the pattern that it should be. I think, Starlet, you mentioned one other time that AI basically entrenches the status quo.
Right.
And that's what it does. So if our systems and our data and our history is biased right now, all it does is make sure that it continues to be biased in the future. That's all AI is doing. We have this belief that AI is better than us and it's going to make these decisions that are fair, but all AI is doing is saying, this is the pattern, carry it forward, right? So even housing valuations, for the same square footage in a similar neighborhood, it is always lower, or houses are valued lower in minority communities than they are in white communities. Like, this is our history. And so we're feeding this data into AI and expecting it to come out with a different result. And that's just fundamentally not how it works.
Right.
So
we're failing to acknowledge that, we had a history of redlining in that zip code. And so there you go. There's your lower valuation on the houses in that zip code. And it just continues the trend of the status quo, which I think at this point we can all acknowledge exists.
Yeah. And I think part of the difficulty is data. Like, that is a massive part of the difficulty, right? Like, how do you make data fairer than we are? And there are a couple ideas out there, but none of them are pretty. Like, none of them are good. No one's happy about any of them. Like, they're just, it's difficult, right? So, but even if you move past the data issue, the thing about AI is its job is to find patterns. And based on those patterns, it decides, well, this pattern is more predictive, or this factor is more predictive than that factor, right? So let me give you an example. They were trying to teach an AI how to recognize a certain kind of trophy fish. Okay, those fish that we love, and so we're, like you hold it up, and
We're talking taxidermied fish.
Well, no, the fish, like if I catch it and it's awesome, then I kind of hold it up. I'm sorry, I
Okay.
love fishing. But I hold it up. You may not know, but I hold it up, right? Because it's awesome. And I want to take a picture. Here, me and my fish, right?
Okay.
So they feed it all this data, all these pictures of the fish, right? And it starts performing really well, and they think it's well trained and it's fine. They put it out into real life and they're feeding it, data of fish, and it's doing horribly. And so they go back through and they actually kind of like are able to interrogate and figure out, well, what are the major factors that you're looking at to determine if this is the right fish? Well, the AI was looking for fingers because in the data, everyone was holding up the fish, right? And so it determined that this trophy fish would have fingers in the picture. And so since there were no fingers, it couldn't identify the fish. This is AI. It is
That
that blind. Like
right.
that's what it doesn't do intelligence, right? So if I'm, part of the problem is, oh, my data may be wrong in this AI system. But the other part is, well, what factors is it looking at to determine if I'm credit worthy? So, when you're looking at credit scores used to be pretty basic. They look at all your payments and, then at some point we added in, the ability to scrape um, uh, clerk of courts to determine if you had like not had defaulted on loans or if you had been sued for rental, right? So we had started adding that information to it. No, this is credit worthy stuff, so nobody really batted an eye. But now, because all data is available and you can pay for it all, credit systems are bringing in all the data they can find. So if they can connect you to your social media, then your social media becomes part of your credit score, right? So
I've,
it's not just
I've
have
heard
you
that. I've heard that when it comes to like your car insurance rates,
yeah,
they're going to somehow AI has reviewed, my Facebook or Instagram account to
yeah,
determine something about me in a car. I don't know what,
because they
but they're
just
linked.
purchase a whole lot of data. And if they can match the data to people, then they get this, what they believe is a holistic view of a person. So now I may say, like with my friend, right? So, I got a new job, right? So I was good to pay the money, for the bar tab on a regular basis, right? So if she were AI, the first thing would be first, did it update? Did anyone feed it the new data of my new job so that it can have an understanding that something has changed and make some different decisions? So that's issue number one. Is that data even being updated on a regular basis? Issue number two is, does it matter even if it does? Because the AI might have decided that whether I had a job or not wasn't really predictive of whether I would pay my bills. It might have decided, well, because she is Black, because she is a woman, because she is not married to a man, or because she is getting divorced, or because she has X amount of children, that I found out using data from her Facebook and her Google feed and this, that, and the other. Those are a lot more predictive of whether she will pay her bills than whether or not she has a job. So it's not enough to get your data correct. The factors that these systems are using to decide your fate may have nothing to do with normal credit factors.
So, but if how are we going to get access to the factors and how each factor or bit of data is weighted? How are we going to know if any particular AI program that's been purchased by any company or any municipality is fair? How are we ever going to look into the algorithms and understand?
Well, I think that's where lawyers play a very unique role, right? Because where does all this stuff end up? In a lawsuit. Because I'm gonna sue. Because I got a new job, like I'm making X amount of money, and I'm still not getting what I expect to get. My credit score is hammered. I'm gonna sue, right? So, how does the court treat these systems? Well, right now, there's this whole argument about we can't tell you really anything because it's all proprietary. Well, that's foolishness because we as attorneys should have a right, to make some decisions, and interrogate the system. And so
What do you recommend lawyers be more aware of in those areas to confront those problems?
I think lawyers play a role in that, we need to be able to interrogate these systems, right? And so I should be able to say within the law that if you provide, this kind of data, then, that allows you to shift the burden onto the individual to prove that your system was discriminatory in some way. We have those kind of burden shifting within the law already. If you don't provide this information and I sue for discrimination, then it should be discrimination per se, right? Or what is it, prescriptive discrimination, right? We have these mechanisms within the law. So if you, as algorithm maker, decide that you don't want to give up any of your data on your training set, any of your data on the factors that are being used in their weighting, and any of the data on the outcomes so that I can interrogate them within, the legal system, well, then you lose. Like that really needs to be what it is. And lawyers can do that because we can regulate ourselves. We make our own rules of evidence. We make our own rules of civil and criminal procedure. And so I think it's well within our right to determine how we're going to treat these systems when they come before the law.
With expert witnesses, for example, we might not understand everything that's being presented, but we have rules of evidence that are regulated according to certain acceptable criteria. We can either admit or deny their testimony based on that criteria.
It's a very similar thing because these are expert systems to some degree, right? And it's the same kind of thing. Like you need to create rules on how we're going to treat this information when it comes in. And so I don't think we need to regulate, attorneys need to try to regulate outside systems. We don't do that now. We just set up rules about, how you're going to lose or how you're able to win when you get sued. That's what we do as attorneys. And we just need to expand that to specifically and intentionally include AI systems or
I think
decision making.
To your point, Masheika, I think if an AI system is proposed to be used, any, legal tribunal, then because it's not an expert, physician or, whatever the expert is, it can't give you its CV and experience. It ought to be able to give you, a history of results and accuracy. And it should be under the fairness definition that we use in the law and not this crazy, but I'm really wrong on both sides. That's not fair under the law. You're right. It should be, faulty per se, if they can't give me the equivalent of a human CV to show me that that person has the expertise to give me the expert opinion.
Yeah, and I think there's discussion about what that, CV should be in a technical standpoint, but I think fundamentally it's going to have to deal with the data that it was trained on, the factors and the weighting that it used to make its decisions, and the impact, so that we can determine if it's fair, under our perception of fair or our definition of fair. I think those are fundamental things that need to be there, and if they aren't, no one's telling you can't sell it. But when someone sues you, you're going to lose. Like that's what we can do within the law. So I think there's been a lot of pressure to, create these overarching systems and whatnot. But I don't think that's necessary. I think the law has these systems. Like we're meant to be flexible for new technology. We just have to recognize that things are moving faster than they used to. And so we can't just wait for judges to make law as these lawsuits go through, because we're finding out like almost week by week different fundamental flaws with this technology. We found out recently, a couple of weeks ago, they came out with a paper with something that they call the under specification problem. And basically what it means is I can train a model and it can perform perfectly in the lab. I can train 15 models and they meet all of my QA specs in the lab. We put them out into practice. I can't tell you which ones are going to work in the real world because there are little itty bitty changes between each individual model, and we can't tell which ones will greatly affect the outcome in the real world. So
fingers on the fish.
Right. So everything I put out that looks like it'll work may go horribly, horribly wrong in the real world. And I won't know why until it goes horribly, horribly wrong. So nothing that we put out right now in AI can we be absolutely confident that it will work in the real world. Like we just figured this out like a month ago. So like this is AI it's a moving target. And the law has never been the place to be experimental. Like we've always kind of lagged behind technology for a reason,
Right.
so we can see the crash coming. But right now we're at the front. We're just riding it. We're just riding it like it's all good, and it's not. And I think we need to take a step back, take a deep breath, If we can't understand the tech, we probably shouldn't be using it. Like I think that's just um, a fundamental truism. Like in the law, if you don't understand it, you don't use it.
Supporters of AI might argue that there's an incredible amount of bias and unfair outcomes in the legal system, and AI would impose objective criteria, which is therefore more fair than the court's arbitrary decision making. Do you agree with that based on AI's current state, but think there's a place for AI to address the issue of legal unfairness in the future?
If it proves it. Right now, everything they're telling us about the beauty of AI is speculative. It's all future. It has the ability to be fair. It has the ability to be objective. It can, it will, but it isn't, right? So I'm not saying there should never be AI in the law. There shouldn't be AI in the law right now, right? If it can prove that it meets our definitions of fairness, if it can prove that it actually does the things we ask it to do, then sure, it's a tool that we can use. And there are some areas where it can do that. And I have no problem with AI being used in those areas. But when it comes to fundamental decision making, AI doesn't make decisions. It doesn't predict. And until it can prove that it can do those things at a better rate than humans, then why are we messing with it? Like on the promise of, when does the law work on a promise?
Right.
Like that's just
We shouldn't be using it when you have people's families and liberty and finances at stake. It's just too serious. If some expert's going to be making that decision on my behalf, he or she better have a fantastic CV. And we're not seeing that.
no, and you can't see that. So that's the thing. Like it's not that I'm an anti-AI person. It's just that I'm realistic about what it's currently capable of doing. And we've been overselling it to all of our detriment. So it is fine if AI gets there. And when it gets there, we can use it, but it's not there right now. So we need to question, why are we using it right now? Because it's cool. People say, oh, it's more efficient. But if you look at the cost of these AI systems, just to train them, to deploy them, and then you have to maintain them. And then you have to train people on how to maintain them. And it's a constant battle because the data drifts and there's just all this stuff that you have to create a pipeline for it, an operational system behind. So now are you hiring, more people? Well, how is that cheaper? Like, do you have to have experts here? How is that cheaper?
You could almost argue that investing 20 hours of bias elimination training in all the decision maker, humans might be more efficient.
Yeah. And the difference between humans and AI is we can change. I read a book in my 30s that was fundamental, that allowed me to move and reinvent myself over and over. It was called Either Or by Kierkegaard. And he mentioned that there are these moments in your life where you can make a decision about who you are. Like for the most part, like we just kind of go along with the type of person, oh, I'm the kind of person who makes this kind of decision. But you hit these moments, and coronavirus has been a moment. But we hit these moments, right, where we actively decide what type of person we want to be. Humans have that ability. AI does not. All AI can say is, because you were this person then, you're going to be this person now, you're going to be this person in the future. And that is terrifying. People can change. We don't often, but there is a hope. And then if people don't change, we can fire them, right? like if you're doing a really horrible job as a judge, you can be recalled. You can be fired. We have control. But if these AI systems are entrenched, they're too expensive to take out.
Yeah, that's true. And if that is the reservoir for this data, you almost can't move away from it easily. I can only imagine, just having a firm and where the data is stored, you better get along well with that vendor because they're going to be there. The effort of moving is terrifying and expensive and time consuming.
The effort of moving into these digital systems is insane. So imagine trying to extricate yourself. Imagine trying to extricate a state. It's not going to happen.
In this case, AI could potentially be scarier and more dangerous than humans' bad decision making. Can you talk about what's going on with predictive policing in Polk County?
Oh, that one hurts. Yeah, so predictive policing has been around for some time, actually since the 60s, with the Semimatics Corporation. I'm reading a book called If Then, blow your hair back. But yeah, we've been trying to do this for some time. We tried to do it in Vietnam. We tried to do it to predict riots in the 60s. People always figure if I have more data, then I can see stuff coming. So this idea now with our supercharged data system was, oh, we can send the police to the right areas and then it won't be a problem. So predictive policing was initially, a way of resource allocation. So I need to send more police in this area or something of that nature, right? We found out it was biased. People were up in arms. It's been thrown out of a lot of different systems. Polk County is the most egregious version of this that I've ever seen. And when you read the stories about it, it's the most egregious version that anyone's ever seen. Because instead of just allocating resources, Polk County basically has decided that our algorithm is going to pop out a top 10 offender list, like people who we think are going to be, recidivist and, bad people over time. And we're not just going to, monitor these people, we're going to actively harass them. So we're going to visit their homes on a regular basis. We're going to, harass their friends and family. We're going to try to arrest them at any point in time. And the stated goal of this program is to make these people leave the county. And so, as we talked earlier, the recidivist algorithms weight age more than any other factor. And so who are they going after? Middle schoolers.
Oh,
13, 14, 15-year-old kids. The cops are visiting their house 20 times a month. It's insane. One of the stories, the mother was like, he went to live somewhere else and they still had to visit her house because the way they've set it up, the police are required to feed information back into the AI. So you have to say how many times you went to see the people on this offender list. And you have to add their friends who you've heard about and their family who they've heard about. You have to go to their jobs. And everyone that you talk to, you feed it back into the algorithm. So now this person becomes part of your list of people that you can surveil and monitor and harass as part of this program. It's insane.
They're required to surveil.
They're required. The police officers are required, to say how many times, they've harassed these people over the course of a week, a month, a year. And there are no checks.
In those cases, AI is finding its way to probable cause affidavits and the grounds to stop these people.
Yeah, because the AI said that they're going to be a problem. So you don't need any other data, really. And so I think, once again, this is where the law plays a part. We don't have to tell the police how to do their jobs, but we can tell them what evidence we're going to make admissible. We can tell them what cases we're going to prosecute. Like, I'm not going to prosecute a mother when you visited her house 14 times over the last 3 weeks and happened to catch her doing something. You harassed her into that. I'm not going to prosecute that. Like, we lawyers have some ability to provide a backstop. Like, I can't stop the police from running their system, but if you're not getting support from the legal system or from the lawyers, then the system dies on its own. Like, I kind of feel like we have to be strong about how we see the law and what we see our role, and use that to protect the general public. There are going to be people who take it too far. There are always going to be those people, but the law, our job and what we have proven over and over again is that the law will stand up and bring things back to norm. And I think we can't be afraid to do that when it comes to, policing and when it comes to technology.
And thank you, Masheika. And while we have you here and your expertise available to us, we're not criminal attorneys, we're civil attorneys. Are there any areas that you want to highlight where AI is being used that would impact our clients or our, ongoing cases?
Your clients are this is where the civil part of this comes in, right? So this is, your clients who are not getting services from the government, or your clients who are, not getting housing, or your clients who are, having issues with the AI sending them home because they're not sick enough, from a hospital, because the AI weights, sickness for certain people lower than it does for other people. There's bias in medical algorithms. And right now, it may not be the direct treatment that they're using it for, but they're using it for management within hospitals. And so that bias may be sending people home early. Who do you sue for malpractice for that? Those questions are going to come in front of you guys.
Are you saying that hospital administration is using AI to determine how long someone's hospital stay?
Yeah,
is?
yeah. It's for general management. So
Oh,
yeah, I don't know that Florida necessarily is using that, but there are hospitals right now who are using AI to manage, as an administrative capacity. So it takes in information from, different doctors, different tests and whatnot, and decides like who's more at risk, for a serious complication and who's less at risk. Well, when it's wrong, who do you sue? Who committed malpractice? Is it technology? Is it the hospital administrator? Who is it? Like these are questions that are going to come across that you need to be concerned about.
I
Yeah,
remember, yeah, I remember when electronic health records were coming out 10 or so years ago, and we wondered where they were going to go, but now this makes sense. And
data.
it does get scary if doctors stop being the ones in charge of the decision making.
You got to feed the machine.
Speaking of electronic records, it's being reported that AI is being used in e-discovery. Do you think that using it in this manner is beneficial or is going to be problematic?
It is it is meant to be a useful tool. It is less problematic than some of the other things that we've discussed, but once again, it has to be specifically trained. AI has to be specifically trained, and people have to ask it specific questions, and then it answers those specific questions. So the difficulty with AI in discovery is nuance. Our natural language processing facility is not very good in AI. Like it can find patterns in data, so it can figure out that, okay, when these terms are together, it tends to be relevant, but when I can't find these terms, it's irrelevant. Like it can do that, but it doesn't actually understand the language. And
Right.
so, we all know you add a word here or there, and it'll completely change, whether this is relevant or privileged, right? The AI can't make that determination. So my understanding is it has worked its way into e-discovery, but the findings tend to be that it's good to kind of like call your basic, your first level of documents that need to be reviewed. So like at a macro level, but once you start getting into the fine tune, you don't want to rely on it because it will miss things. And as an attorney, you're going to be held responsible for that. So it should be a tool, but you got to keep your eye on it. It's just like any other tool.
We've seen that um, with our research program, which shall go unnamed. It's great, finds a lot of the cases, but might miss that key case that you find, a few weeks later.
Yeah, and that's painful. We've all we've all kind of done that on our own, and it hurt. But it's worse. It's much worse when the AI had you like thinking that you were golden, and
Right.
then you get hammered or slammed, or just you find out later, and it's just such a gotcha. Yeah, it's tough. But that's the thing. It's not going to be perfect because it doesn't actually understand language. It's just looking for patterns, and patterns only get you so far.
So what should be the big takeaway here for attorneys who have made it all the way through this discussion with us?
Thank you, first and foremost. I think the big takeaway is it's here and you can't ignore it. And it is going to be a major part of your practice and your life for the foreseeable future. And we need to be proactive because we've been reactive and this tech moves so fast that you just find it places. Like a lot of times, the article I sent you, a lot of times people don't even know that the AI is being used until they're sitting in court, cross-examining a witness and like, why was this decision made? Oh, well, we changed the algorithm. You're using an algorithm? Like no one even knew. Like, so I think it's be aware and ask fundamental questions. You need to, as an industry, we need to find out, we need to have some sort of list of where AI is being used, in the state of Florida, especially in the governmental. We can't necessarily do it in the private sector, but within our government and within our systems, we need to know where it's being used. And then we need to start asking fundamental questions like, do I need AI for this? Is there a simpler system? If I use that spreadsheet system, there's no issue of bias. There's no issue of data. Like none of that stuff is a problem. And I'm solving the problem that, originally drove us to look to technology. So we need to start questioning, why are we choosing AI? Is it the right tool for this? It may be, but we should ask the question. So I think the big takeaway for lawyers is, interrogate. It's what we do, it's what we love. So, find out where it's being used, figure out, if this is the tool we need. And if it is, then we need to start creating some rules because it's the wild, wild west and it's terrifying.
It is. Well, thank you, Masheika. It's wonderful to see you all the way out in California. We don't get this treat very often, but I'll look forward to our next chat. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me and listening.